Our managing partner, Anthony Williams, recently sat down with Sacramento Mayor and former California Senate Majority Leader Darrell Steinberg. The subjects: homelessness, mental health, and the way for protests to be heard without being destructive. From Ballard Studios in West Hollywood, California, it's 13th and Park.
We give you information, not a panic attack.
I mean, look what's going on. I mean, my God.
This was it. My kids were gonna die.
That time is gone forever.
This is the biggest story in America.
We weren't prepared for this.
Don't you want to speak truth to power?
Toughest thing I ever had to do.
Mayor Steinberg, welcome to the show.
Good to be with my old
We're
friend.
calling you Mayor Steinberg, though, man.
Just call me Darrell,
Oh, we'll
please.
call you Darrell.
The only people I insist call me Mayor are my kids.
I love it. Your time in the Senate as pro tem, and you came in like at a crazy time.
You know, after I left the legislature in 2014, as you know, I had made mental health and fixing this broken system my signature legislative priority for 14 years. And when I left, I decided that I wanted to start a foundation, an advocacy foundation, to try to enhance leadership around mental health. So we are now in our 10th year, the Steinberg Institute. Yeah. And I was down here attending the board meeting and talking about how we now focus the state's efforts on implementation of all these signature initiatives that the governor and the legislature have put forward.
How did you get started on mental health as an issue, as a policy issue, as an advocacy issue?
I went to college in Berkeley and lived in the dorms when I was 17 years old. And my dormitory was where they centered the famous Center for Independent Living, which was the most significant advocacy institute for the rights of the disabled. And I met a lot of students with severe disabilities.
Wow.
And I had this thing about disability and the flip side of disability being ability.
Right.
So fast forward, I got elected to the city council as a young man in the 90s. The city got involved in a big lawsuit with its charity over concentration in the downtown area.
That's Loaves and Fishes,
Loaves
right?
and Fishes.
Great Loaves and Fishes for feeding people. They thought it was attracting too many.
They thought it was attracting too many people, and the city sued Loaves and Fishes for feeding too many people on Sunday. I voted against the lawsuit because I thought it was wrong. And at the same time, I was running for the legislature.
Right.
And I decided, really against the advice of my campaign people, that I wanted to make my signature issue and campaign on improving the mental health system, because people don't know anything about California history. They know this, that in the 1960s, Governor Reagan and the legislature, it was bipartisan, shut the state mental hospitals. And that was the right thing to do, because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was fiction, but it was actually more real than not. There was a second half of the promise that 90% of the funding from the closure of those state hospitals would be spent in the community to build a decent system of community mental health care. And it never happened. So I decided that I wanted to make this my priority. No one else was working on it. I introduced several bills in my early years, not knowing any better, asked for a lot of money, ended up with $10 million the first year, $55 million the second year. We built this integrated services for the homeless, mentally ill, showed reduced hospitalization, reduced arrests, reduced days of homelessness for a cohort of about 5,000 people every year. And then we decided to go to the ballot and try to pass an initiative, and we did. Proposition 63, the tax on millionaires.
That was the Mental Health Services Act. And that, up until Prop 1 just passed, was essentially the law of the land in terms of permanent source of funding for mental health.
Yes.
To counties and
It's generated $31 billion over the last 20 years. As I like to joke, I thought I had written the perfect law, but there's no such thing. Because when we wrote this initiative, we laid out what we thought was the right vision to build a comprehensive set of services for people who need it. And the truth of the matter is it's been a great success. But as the problem of chronic homelessness has grown to be the signature issue, Governor Newsom, who championed this issue like no other governor in history. I always told him this, that, boy, when I was in the legislature, I could only dream that a governor would mention mental health in a state address or in some other major speech. And together, and with a lot of advocates, we worked to rewrite my perfect law from 2004, and it became Prop 1, and now the money's more focused on housing supports for people with chronic homelessness, wraparound services for people who need the help the most.
There are a lot of big cities in other states that are about the same as Sacramento that we think about. And given that success that you just now seen, what are some of those lessons and takeaways that you think, those other cities could benefit from?
This can be distilled into several common sense principles. There ought to be some form of legal obligation to provide the minimal levels of housing and of services to people who need it, who have fallen out. And at the same time, there ought to be a clear responsibility for people when those services and when that housing is offered to accept it. So there is a formula, and it is to combine rights and responsibility, to increase the number of temporary beds, the number of permanent housing units, which is really the key, and to make sure that all these mental health dollars, including under Proposition 1 in California, are being used with a laser focus. I'm not ideological about this. I think there ought to be a legal right to housing and a legal obligation to accept it. And even if those won't be the formal doctrines in the society, everything we do needs to move towards it.
I remember when you were elected pro tem, and everybody thought, you got to be kind of a hard ass, I guess, to be a leader. You weren't, and yet you, as pro tem, solved some of the most intractable problems that the state had faced in a long time.
When I was in the Assembly for 6 years, I chaired appropriations and budget, and I was not ready to be Speaker. I didn't feel it. I didn't have the confidence. By the time I got to the Senate, because of the work I had done in the Assembly, I had the confidence, and I knew the time was right for me. And so you get a lot farther being decent to other people. You put out a good vibe to people and you care, it will come back to you, whether you intend it or not. In politics, right, I've always thought of myself as a progressive. I believe that government has a proper role as a catalyst to help improve the lives of others. And my legislation, my work backs it up. So I become mayor, and there's the rise of really the progressive movement, especially on the young people. And they may know my history, but they don't really care. It's like, what have you done for me lately? And so I've had to learn, and I have learned a lot about how to lead, not only at a different stage of my life, but in a way that relates to people who see the world very differently. The civil rights movement, for example, which I consider, to be the most heroic period of time in my lifetime. A lot of young people say, well, what really changed? Well, a lot changed. And so I've really had to change the way that I lead and the way that I relate, and to do more listening. A lot of local governments have dealt with across this state and probably across the country is protests around the war in, Israel and Palestine. Wow. I started my community work as chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Sacramento, and I call myself, and I am, a proud American Jew, and I'm pro-Israel. I dislike the Netanyahu government and disagree completely with its policies, but I am pro-Israel. And so the Palestinian American community wanted a ceasefire resolution. The Jewish community leadership largely said, no, certainly not the ceasefire resolutions that have been passed around the country that didn't condemn Hamas and did not recognize the importance of a safe and secure Israel. And so I decided in the end to write my own resolution because we were having protests every week at council. We weren't able to do the public's business. People wanted to be heard. So I wrote my own resolution, and it was substantive and balanced. Condemned the settlements. It criticized the Netanyahu government approach. It called for humanitarian aid and a ceasefire, and it acknowledged Israel's right not only to exist, but the importance of Israel, and condemned Hamas.
What is next for Darrell Steinberg?
One thing I'd like to do in my future is find a way to work with you.
We got an empty office right over here.
I'm not necessarily applying for a specific job, but I would like to work with you. We served together during some very, very formative, important years. And there may be an opportunity to run one more time for state office, maybe attorney general. I've also thought maybe there's a need to start a public policy mediation and conciliation service to help resolve the differences on major issues of public policy as early as possible. I've done a lot of mediation. I helped resolve the the UC grad student strike at the end of 2022. They brought me in to do that. And I think about maybe there's a way to create a leadership role outside of public office. And the truth of the matter is, for the first time in my life, I want to kind of let it come this way as opposed to just seeking it, because I really don't know. I want to do something that is of service, that's meaningful.
Yep.
Might be a tiny bit less stress.
Yeah.
And
So you say now.
Yeah.
That hasn't worked out for
it
you
hasn't worked
just
out,
yet.
but we will see, man. No matter what.
Yeah.
I've been very lucky to be able to serve, and I'd like to keep doing something that is of service to people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why you keep getting pulled back in. I mean, I know the governor brought you in to help on the reimagining of San
Quentin, which is a great project.
Yeah, and I also know you did play a huge role in helping to shape Prop 1 and moving that campaign forward.
Lawmaking obviously is crucial, how you set the law, but implementation is every bit as important.
Yep.
We sometimes lose the focus on what it takes to implement an important law effectively. And that's certainly true with all the mental health dollars.
Yeah.
We got to get the money out fast. We got to get it out effectively, and to show in a very clear and transparent way results to the people.
When we were working together, I can't remember who was in there or what the issue was, but we had the two sides on some major legislative fight. You and I were in your office about to walk in to that meeting, and we were like, what are we going to do? What are we going to say? How are we going to get them to come to the table? It was like, I don't know, we'll just make it up.
I said, you take that meeting.
Take that meeting. You probably did. It's to that point where, people think that you just have all the answers and you just go in and we literally sat there in your office right before we walked in to try to figure out how to bring these two sides together.
There's several times, only did it a couple of times, the way we finally got a state budget during the toughest of tough times was to lock down the House, not let members leave.
Yeah.
So I did it twice, I think.
Yeah.
The first time, it was relatively successful, except a number of members had their car keys and went down the basement and drove out.
Yeah.
So I learned the lesson the second time. We had the sergeants take their car keys. And so finally, 100 days, I go, we've tried everything. I'm locking us all in. It was a Friday night, and nobody's leaving until we get a budget. So a Republican member of the Senate who had not talked to us all year because he had a dispute with the prior leader. I'm sitting in my office about 6 o'clock. He knocks on the door. He comes on in. I said, what can I do for you, Senator? We haven't talked in a while. He said, Mr. Pro Tem, I have a favor to ask of you. My daughter has a soccer game tomorrow morning, Saturday morning at 10 o'clock in the Valley. Can I go? Well, I'd locked everybody in. And I said, well, Senator, I'd love nothing more than for you to go to your daughter's soccer game, but you got to go get me 4 votes. And he left. And by 8 o'clock in the evening, he came back with the votes. That's how we solved the 2010 state budget.
A soccer game.
It's a human
endeavor. Mayor Steinberg, Darrell, my dear friend, one of my best friends in life. I appreciate you coming in, man.
Back at you, Anthony.
Good times, man.
Loved it.
All right.
Thank you so much.